There comes a moment when God does not shout. He does not warn a second time. He does not argue, persuade, or explain himself. He simply steps back. And when God withdraws his protection, what begins to collapse is never only a life. It is the lie that life was quietly built upon. What you're about to hear is not revenge. It is not emotional satisfaction. It is not fantasy dressed up as faith. It is the quiet, terrifying order of divine justice. What happens when everything the narcissist depended on is finally, completely, allowed to fall? When God begins to take, he does not take randomly. God never dismantles a life on impulse. When he takes with precision. What looks like sudden loss to everyone watching is often the final stage of a long, quiet withdrawal, one unnoticed by the proud, ignored by the arrogant, and completely misunderstood by the unrepentant. The narcissist does not reach rock bottom because God suddenly becomes harsh. They reach rock bottom because God has finally stopped supporting what truth could never sustain on its own. For years, they were surrounded by opportunities they mistook as proof of their own superiority. Doors opened. People listened. Influence grew. Circumstances bent in their favor. And because the consequences of pride didn't arrive immediately, they assumed they never would. This is one of the oldest deceptions hidden inside human nature. The belief that delay means approval. The belief that patience means permission. The belief that blessing means endorsement. The narcissist builds an entire identity on top of this misunderstanding. They assume their success validates their behavior. They assume their comfort justifies their choices. They assume their ability to escape accountability proves they are simply smarter than everyone around them. But God's patience has never once been evidence of agreement. It is evidence of mercy. Mercy gives time. Mercy gives opportunity. Mercy gives space for reflection, for humility, for repentance. And yet, the narcissist rarely uses that space to change. Instead, they use it to strengthen the illusion. Every avoided consequence convinces them they are untouchable. Every small victory feeds the false self a little more. Every season of apparent stability reinforces the belief that the structure they've built is secure. What they fail to recognize, what pride will not let them see, is that God was never holding that structure together forever. A life built on control requires constant reinforcement. A life built on image requires constant maintenance. A life built on superiority requires constant validation. None of these things create strength. They only create dependency. And eventually, God allows that dependency to reveal itself for exactly what it is. This is where the withdrawal begins. The support starts fading. The stability begins weakening. The confidence becomes harder and harder to maintain. What once felt effortless now requires increasing effort just to hold together. The narcissist senses resistance where there was once ease. Pressure where there was once comfort. Instability where there was once unshakable certainty. And even then, even as the ground begins to shift beneath them, many refuse to examine the foundation itself. They continue blaming circumstances. They continue blaming people. They continue searching for some external explanation, because the one explanation they cannot tolerate is the simple possibility that the structure was flawed from the very beginning. God does not destroy the narcissist. He dismantles the illusion the narcissist trusted more than they ever trusted truth. That is why this process feels so devastating to watch unfold. What is being removed is not merely success. It is the false identity that success was holding up. What is being taken away is not merely comfort. It is the belief that comfort somehow proved righteousness. And when God begins removing those supports, the foundation finally shows itself for what it always was. A carefully maintained structure, built entirely on pride. And pride has never once been capable of carrying the full weight of reality. Not forever. Not for anyone. Chapter 2, What They Worshipped Most. When God begins to take, He does not begin with what is small. He begins with what was never meant to be worshipped, but was anyway. The narcissist does not merely enjoy success. They depend on it completely. Money is no longer simply a resource. It becomes proof of worth. Influence is no longer stewardship. It becomes evidence of superiority. Control is no longer responsibility. It becomes identity itself. This is exactly why the removal feels so severe when it finally comes. God is not taking away something the narcissist possessed. He is taking away something the narcissist trusted more than truth. For years, the narcissist organized their entire life around external reinforcement. Their sense of security depended on admiration. Their sense of importance depended on attention. Their sense of power depended on being needed, feared, admired, or obeyed. Without these things, they don't merely feel disappointed. They feel diminished, because everything meaningful about their identity has been attached to something completely outside themselves. And this is exactly where the danger begins. Anything that replaces God at the center of a life eventually becomes too heavy for that life to carry. The narcissist rarely notices this transition happening, because it happens so gradually. Success becomes self-worth. Influence becomes self-worth. Recognition becomes self-worth. Control becomes self-worth. And eventually, losing any one of these things feels like losing themselves entirely. That is exactly why divine withdrawal strikes so deeply when it finally arrives. God does not need to remove everything overnight. He simply removes the supports that were never designed to carry a human soul in the first place. The influence that once opened doors begins to weaken. The admiration that once arrived so effortlessly becomes uncertain. The leverage they once held over people becomes less and less effective. The authority they assumed would last forever starts slipping quietly through their fingers. The narcissist interprets this entire season as injustice. They search desperately for someone to blame. A former partner, a disloyal friend, a jealous colleague, some hidden enemy working against them. Anyone except the person staring back at them from the mirror. Because accountability threatens the very identity they have spent years constructing and protecting. Humility could save them in this moment. Reflection could help them. Truth could correct them completely. But those are the exact things they have spent a lifetime avoiding at all costs. God does not remove wealth because wealth itself is evil. He removes it when wealth has quietly become an idol. God does not dismantle influence because influence is sinful. He dismantles it the moment influence has replaced character. God does not challenge power because power itself is wrong. He challenges it the moment power is used to elevate self instead of serving others. The narcissist confuses blessing with entitlement. They believe what they possess proves who they fundamentally are. But possessions are not identity. Status is not identity. Influence is not identity. Control is not identity. When these things begin disappearing one by one, the narcissist discovers a frightening reality they were never prepared for. There is very little holding them up underneath all of it. The structure appears strong from the outside, but internally, it depends entirely on constant reinforcement. And that reinforcement is exactly what God begins removing. This is why the ground starts disappearing beneath their feet. Not because heaven is being cruel, but because heaven is finally revealing the truth that was always there. And the truth is simple. Anything built around self eventually collapses under the full weight of reality. If you have learned to stop chasing validation and started trusting God's timing instead, hold on to that. Because what God builds through truth can survive everything that pride never could. Chapter 3. The fall accelerates through their own choices. When God withdraws his protection, he does not need to hurry the collapse along. The narcissist does that entirely on their own. This is one of the most misunderstood realities of divine justice. People often imagine judgment arriving like a sudden event, a dramatic moment, a visible strike, an unmistakable act that changes everything overnight. But far more often, judgment unfolds quietly through freedom. God simply steps back, and the narcissist steps forward, directly into the very nature they spent years refusing to confront. Without restraint, they continue choosing exactly what they have always chosen. Control over conscience. Image over truth. Advantage over integrity. Pride over humility. The difference now is that there is less and less protection standing between those choices and their consequences. What once appeared clever begins to look reckless. What once appeared strategic begins to look desperate. What once produced short-term rewards now begins producing long-term, compounding damage. The narcissist rarely recognizes this shift happening in real time. They believe the answer is simply to push harder. But every attempt to preserve the false self only increases the pressure on a structure that is already beginning to weaken from the inside. This is exactly why the fall accelerates. Not because God is pushing them downward, but because they refuse to stop walking in the same direction that led them here in the first place. Opportunities for humility appear along the way. They interpret each one as an attack. Every crossroads presents a choice, and every choice moves them closer to the very consequences they keep insisting cannot possibly happen to them. The narcissist often surrounds themselves with people who reinforce their illusions rather than challenge them. They prefer agreement over honesty, admiration over accountability, flattery over truth. And slowly, the voices that could have helped them change are gradually removed from their life, while the voices that encourage self-deception grow louder and louder. This creates a dangerous, accelerating cycle. The less they listen, the less they learn. The less they learn, the more mistakes they make. The more mistakes they make, the more defensive they become. And the more defensive they become, the less capable they are of recognizing reality at all. What could have remained a single warning becomes a pattern. What could have remained a pattern becomes momentum. What could have remained a moment of correction becomes an entire season of consequences. The frightening part is that the narcissist often interprets this acceleration as proof that everyone else is the problem. They see resistance everywhere and conclude they are being opposed. They see consequences everywhere and conclude they are being targeted. But the truth is much simpler than that. Reality is finally responding to them honestly, for the first time in a very long time. For years, the cost of their choices was quietly absorbed by other people. Family members carried burdens they never created. Friends overlooked behavior that should have been confronted directly. Relationships compensated for weaknesses they refused to address in themselves. But when God withdraws his support, the cost finally returns home, to the only person who was ever truly responsible for it. Relationships become strained, because they were built on transaction rather than mutual care. Trust begins disappearing, because it was managed rather than genuinely earned. Opportunities begin shrinking, because character can no longer support what ambition keeps demanding. The narcissist calls this unfair. Heaven calls it exposure, because divine justice does not always arrive through punishment. Sometimes it arrives through permission. Permission to keep choosing. Permission to keep walking. Permission to keep following a path until that very path finally reveals exactly where it was leading all along. This is the terrifying mercy of God. He allows a person to see the full outcome of what they insisted upon, not because he delights in their downfall, but because truth cannot be understood while illusion is still being carefully protected. And so the collapse gains speed. Not because God has become harsher, but because the delay has finally ended, the protection has lifted, and the consequences are finally catching up with the choices that quietly created them all along. Chapter 4. Everything that once protected them collapses. There comes a moment in every unraveling when the narcissist realizes that what once protected them no longer holds. The protections they depended on begin to fail one by one. The systems that once absorbed the consequences of their behavior stop absorbing them. The people who once quietly covered for them begin stepping back. The circumstances that once softened reality begin hardening around them. And the narcissist finally finds themselves facing pressures they have spent years carefully avoiding. What collapses first is not always visible to anyone watching. It's the quiet sense of certainty that once allowed them to move through life without ever questioning themselves. For years, they depended on external buffers. Money softened their mistakes. Influence excused their behavior. Charm delayed the accountability that should have come sooner. Reputation protected them from scrutiny they should have faced. Even when cracks appeared, there was always something available to cover them. But none of these things were ever foundations. They were insulation. And insulation cannot save a structure whose foundation is already weakening underneath it. This is why the collapse feels so confusing to the narcissist when it finally arrives. They look at the surface of their life and see many of the same things still present. The job may still exist. The income may still be there. The image may not yet be completely destroyed. And yet, something feels different. The confidence is no longer natural. The control requires far more effort than it ever used to. The certainty begins slipping away in ways they can't quite name. What once felt effortless now feels exhausting. What once felt secure now feels fragile. What once felt permanent now feels strangely temporary. The narcissist senses the change happening but rarely understands where it's actually coming from. So they search for someone to blame. They blame difficult people. They blame changing circumstances. They blame betrayal. They blame bad luck. Because acknowledging the truth would require them to finally examine the structure itself. And that is the one thing pride resists more than anything else. God does not need to destroy what is false. He simply stops maintaining it. And when that happens, the accumulated cost of years spent avoiding truth begins quietly returning home. Relationships begin changing. People who once tolerated manipulation become less willing to tolerate it. People who once overlooked selfishness begin seeing it far more clearly. People who once carried burdens for the narcissist grow tired of carrying them any longer. The narcissist interprets this as disloyalty. But it is not disloyalty. It is simply reality. Because relationships built on control cannot survive forever. Relationships built on fear cannot survive forever. Relationships built on utility cannot survive forever. Eventually, pressure exposes exactly what the relationship was actually built upon all along. And the same pattern begins appearing everywhere else in their life. Influence becomes weaker. Authority becomes less effective. Explanations become less convincing. The image that once protected them requires increasing effort to maintain, and the effort never seems to be quite enough anymore. This creates a growing instability inside the narcissist that they cannot escape. Sleep becomes more difficult. Peace becomes more difficult. Certainty becomes more difficult to hold on to. The very person who once appeared so confident now spends increasing amounts of energy simply trying to preserve an identity that no longer feels secure beneath them. Not because God is being cruel, but because the false self was never sustainable to begin with. Everything that once protected them begins collapsing because none of it was ever rooted in truth. This is where rock bottom stops being a distant possibility and starts becoming an actual destination. Because one by one, every artificial support disappears, until nothing remains standing between the narcissist and the full weight of their own life. And when that finally happens, there is nowhere left to hide. Only reality remains. Chapter 5. God allows the fall to be seen. There are collapses God allows to happen quietly, and there are collapses He allows to be seen by everyone watching. The difference has never been cruelty. For a long time, the narcissist survives behind a carefully managed image. Consequences are delayed. Mistakes are explained away. Patterns are hidden beneath charm, influence, reputation, or simply the willingness of other people to keep giving endless second chances. From the outside, everything appears stable. The image remains intact. The narrative remains fully under control. But concealment has never once been protection. When God withdraws His protection completely, He does not need to humiliate the narcissist. He simply allows reality to become visible on its own. This is where exposure truly begins, not with scandal, not with spectacle, not with public destruction, but with something far quieter. Clarity. The narcissist's greatest fear has never been loss. It is visibility without control. They can tolerate difficulty in private. They can tolerate pressure behind closed doors. What they cannot tolerate is being seen accurately, because their entire identity depends completely on perception. The image must be maintained. The narrative must be protected. The illusion must survive at all costs. Without those things, the false self begins to fracture from the inside out. This is exactly why exposure feels so devastating to them. The narcissist spends years carefully controlling what people see. They manage every impression. They shape every conversation. They explain away every contradiction. They present themselves as stronger, wiser, kinder, or more innocent than reality could ever support. For a season, this works. People believe them. People defend them. People overlook the warning signs right in front of them. But eventually, something shifts. The explanations stop working the way they used to. The contradictions become harder and harder to ignore. The patterns become easier and easier to recognize. And what was once dismissed as coincidence begins looking like something that was there the entire time. This is not because God is turning people against them. It is because God is no longer turning truth away. That difference matters more than anything else. Divine justice is not always an attack. Sometimes it is simply the quiet removal of concealment. The narcissist notices the shift almost immediately. People ask more questions now. People become less trusting. People stop accepting every explanation without examining it first. Words that once carried real weight begin losing their influence. Stories that once convinced people begin sounding strangely familiar. The authority they once depended on starts weakening, and there is very little they can do to stop it, because truth possesses a strength illusion has never had. Truth does not require constant maintenance. It simply stands on its own. Illusion must be protected every single day. That is exactly why exposure becomes so exhausting for the narcissist. The image requires more and more effort while producing fewer and fewer results. More energy is spent defending what fewer people are willing to believe. This creates a quiet panic beneath the surface, not because everything has become public yet, but because control over perception is slipping away one piece at a time. And for the narcissist, that loss of control feels exactly like the loss of identity itself. What makes this stage so powerful is that God doesn't need to announce anything. He doesn't need to convince anyone. He doesn't need to organize their downfall personally. The narcissist's own patterns become the witness. Their own choices become the evidence. Their own behavior becomes the revelation. The mask begins falling, simply under the weight of reality. And once reality becomes visible, the illusion finally loses its shelter. This is the quiet terror of true exposure. Not being attacked, not being accused, but finally, completely being understood. Chapter 6. The realization that they are losing everything. There comes a point in the collapse when the narcissist finally begins to understand what is actually happening to them. Not because someone explains it to them. Not because they suddenly grow humble overnight. But because the evidence becomes impossible to keep ignoring. For a long time, they believe the losses are temporary. They assume the influence will return on its own. They assume the admiration will return eventually. They assume the image can be repaired and the control can be fully restored. But eventually, a deeper, more frightening realization begins to surface. What is disappearing is not merely what they possess. It is what they depended on to define themselves entirely. This is exactly what makes the collapse so severe. The narcissist does not simply enjoy admiration, they build their entire identity around it. They do not simply enjoy influence, they use it as evidence of their own worth. They do not simply enjoy control, they depend on it completely to feel secure inside their own life. For years, these things functioned as external supports holding together an internal illusion that was never built to last. As long as people admired them, they felt significant. As long as people obeyed them, they felt powerful. As long as people reinforced the image, they felt stable. But the problem has always been the same. None of these things can actually create identity. They can only imitate it. And eventually, every imitation reaches its limit. This is exactly why divine withdrawal becomes so devastating at this stage. God is not merely removing resources anymore. He is exposing dependency itself. The narcissist discovers that much of what they called confidence actually depended on admiration. Much of what they called strength actually depended on control. Much of what they called security actually depended on circumstances remaining favorable around them. As those supports disappear one after another, an uncomfortable question finally begins to surface. What remains when the reinforcement is completely gone? What remains when people stop validating the image? What remains when influence has weakened beyond repair? What remains when the narrative can no longer be controlled at all? This is the question the narcissist spends years avoiding, because beneath the image, there was often very little ever allowed to develop. Character was sacrificed for appearance. Humility was sacrificed for superiority. Transformation was sacrificed for performance. The false self demanded so much constant attention that the authentic self was completely neglected for years. Now, the consequences of that neglect finally begin to appear. The narcissist discovers that the structure they trusted most was almost entirely external. It depended on reactions from other people. It depended on circumstances cooperating in their favor. It depended on constant reinforcement from the world around them. And without those things, the structure simply struggles to stand on its own. That is why this collapse feels so much larger than the loss of money, influence, or reputation alone. The true loss runs far deeper than that. The narcissist is watching the false self lose its entire support system in real time. For years, they believed the image was the person. Now they are finally forced to confront the possibility that the image was only ever a construction, a carefully maintained narrative, a substitute standing in for genuine identity. And this realization changes absolutely everything. Because once the structure loses its supports, the truth becomes impossible to avoid any longer. What God is taking away was never meant to carry the weight of a soul in the first place. And yet those were the very things the narcissist trusted most. That is why this stage feels like losing everything, because they are not merely losing what they owned. They are losing what they genuinely believe themselves to be. Chapter 7. Removed before the impact. There is a truth many people struggle to accept fully. God does not always explain why He removes you from something. He simply removes you before it becomes necessary to explain. If you are listening to this from a place of distance rather than chaos right now, understand exactly what that distance means. It is not rejection. It is not abandonment. It is not loss. It is protection. Many people spend years wondering why certain relationships ended, why certain doors closed, why certain connections became impossible to maintain at the time. It felt painful. It felt confusing. It felt unfair. But distance has always had a purpose. God does not always rescue His people by changing the situation around them. Sometimes He rescues them by removing them from it entirely. The narcissistic structure you were once connected to was already weakening long before the collapse became visible to anyone else. You sensed the instability before you could ever fully explain it. You felt the pressure, the distortion, the exhausting responsibility of carrying burdens that never belonged to you in the first place. You found yourself explaining behavior that should never have required explanation, and defending actions that should never have required defense. Eventually, God intervened, because God never assigned you the responsibility of holding together something He had already intended to dismantle. Many people misunderstand this completely. They believe faithfulness means remaining in every difficult situation no matter the cost. They believe loyalty requires endless endurance. But there are moments when obedience looks exactly like departure. There are moments when wisdom looks exactly like distance. There are moments when protection arrives disguised as a closed door that you didn't ask for and didn't understand at the time. The timing always matters. You were removed before the exposure became complete. Before the acceleration reached its peak. Before the collapse became undeniable to everyone watching. Not because you were better than anyone else involved, but because you were never meant to remain attached to something that was always going to fall apart. Had you remained, you might have continued absorbing consequences that never belonged to you. You might have mistaken compassion for responsibility and loyalty for assignment. This is the hidden mercy buried inside separation. You are no longer responsible for fixing what God is exposing. You are no longer responsible for carrying what God is removing. You are no longer responsible for protecting what God has already chosen not to protect. That is exactly why distance now feels so different than it once did. You can observe without becoming entangled again. You can understand without being consumed by it. You can recognize the collapse happening without ever being drawn back into it, because God removed you before the impact ever came. What felt like loss was actually preservation. What felt like rejection was actually rescue. What felt like an ending was actually the beginning of your release from a structure that could never have survived the weight of truth anyway. Chapter 8. Rock Bottom, the Final Order. Rock bottom is often deeply misunderstood. It is not chaos. It is not revenge. And it is not God losing his patience. It is simply the moment when everything false can no longer remain standing on its own. The image has lost its protection. The illusion has lost its support. The false self has lost every structure that once sustained it. What remains, finally, is truth, undiluted, unguarded, and impossible to avoid any longer. For the narcissist, this is the final reckoning. Not because God is determined to destroy them, but because God is no longer delaying the reality that was always coming. The collapse has completed its work. The exposure has completed its work. The illusion has finally reached its end. For you, the lesson is something entirely different. You were never called to carry what God was dismantling all along. You were never called to rescue what truth itself was exposing. You were called to walk away, to preserve your peace, to trust God's timing completely, even when you couldn't see where it was leading. The collapse was never your responsibility. The outcome was never your responsibility. What God allowed to fall was never yours to hold together in the first place. And when the noise finally settles, when every false structure has fallen and every illusion has lost its shelter, one thing remains completely unchanged, exactly as it always has been. God's truth stands, and everything ever built against it eventually falls.